When I ran my first marathon in 2020, I spent the whole taper scared out of my mind. I was scared of the pain. I was scared of the unknown. I didn't even know if I was gonna make it to the finish. I actually ended up, actually crying in the convention center before the race in 2020. When I ran Houston again in 2022, I made it a goal to make sure the same thing didn't happen again. I wanted to approach the race from a strong, positive mental standpoint. I want to share what I learned during that journey and how I'm applying those lessons to the Boston Marathon that I'm running in 4 days. What do people get anxious about? The marathon is a distance that I tend to get more anxious about than others, but I also feel like the taper crazies apply in pretty much all of my races. The biggest cause of anxiety for me is just wondering how much is this race going to hurt? If you've done both a 5K and a half marathon, you know how different the pain is between those two. In the half, it's more of a slow burn, and the race shouldn't really feel too hard until pretty far into the race. For a 5K, the pain kind of ramps up faster and it burns there more, but it's also over faster too. Obviously, if you are really racing a distance, you kind of signed up for the pain in some sense, but that really doesn't stop us humans from worrying about it. For a first attempt at a particular race distance, there's a fear of the unknown. And honestly, I'd apply that to race courses too. When I ran my first marathon, I was freaked out that I'd literally never run past 20 miles. And I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to do it, or that it was going to be incredibly painful. And there's that pain fear again. The fear of the unknown can be really hard to nail down and address logically, which is why it can be such a pernicious little fear. So far, I've run just the 2 flat marathons at Houston with great weather. So right now, the much hillier Boston course is what's causing a lot of my nerves. Performance anxiety is a huge taper problem too. You spent weeks or months or even years maybe training for this race, and of course you really want to do well, but did you do enough? Did you overcook yourself? Are your legs going to feel flat on race day? Should you have done an extra rep or 2 in the workout you did on January 18th, just to add a little bit more fitness? Nobody wants to have a bad day in a race, but since we can't predict the future yet, all we can do is worry about what we've already done and try to figure out whether it's enough. People will dig into their training logs and compare the current cycle to past cycles and try to see if they worked hard enough, or if the workouts got faster, or whether they ran more miles last cycle or this cycle. Finally, there's the weather. Is it going to be too warm? Too humid? Sunny or overcast? Rain? Snow? What am I dealing with? You can't control the weather, but you can obsess about it starting about 10 days out from race day. Boston especially has insane weather swings, and so far I've seen cloudy and a high of 60 for this year, I've seen sunny and a high in the 70s, and right now we're looking at rainy, mid-50s with headwinds. Given the options, honestly, I'll take it. When I was looking for ways to have a more positive experience in my race last year, I came across a great piece from Outside Magazine. The title was "Suffer from Pre-Race Anxiety? Here's How to Accept the Pain." And that seemed like exactly the article that I was looking for. The hook of the article that got me invested was a reference to an oft-repeated mantra in Dune, the sci-fi book from Frank Herbert. "Fear is the mind killer," he wrote in his acclaimed science fiction novel Dune. "Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration." Jeff Simons, a sports psychologist at Cal State University East Bay, put it a little bit more clinically. "Anxiety and pain have a reciprocal relationship," he says. "Pain naturally stimulates fear, and fear makes pain intolerable. Fear is the mind killer. Fear makes you crazy, and fear makes the pain worse." So knowing that, when I can start feeling the fear well up in my chest, I remember that being afraid of the pain before I'm running is absolutely useless, and will only serve to make the pain seem bigger. Now that's easier said than done, but luckily the article gives a little guidance there too. One of the best ways to get through Herbert's little death into the reality of the race, Simon says, is to reconceptualize the pain that you're feeling. Herbert put it this way: "I will face my fear, I will permit it to pass over me and through me, and when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see the path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing left. Only I will remain." My understanding from that is that I need to acknowledge my fear, let the feeling exist for a moment, and then make a conscious effort to set it aside, because it does nothing to serve me right now, and it will do nothing to serve me on race day. Being able to tell myself that it's unhelpful to feel that fear has helped me make the mental effort to redirect myself when I start feeling that fear. Again, It's easier said than done, but it was this mental orientation that was most helpful for me during the last taper and has continued to be helpful for me during this taper. How do you deal with the fear of the unknown without actually going into the unknown? I tend to feel more confident going into unknown situations when I know that I've done as much as possible to know the unknown before I face it. In this case, it's been reading race reports from other people who have already encountered that unknown that helps me a lot. Luckily for me, Boston and Houston are both pretty big races, so there's a lot out there to read. I typically stick to Reddit to get those race reports, and the two subreddits I use are running and advanced running. Between the two, I can usually find a wealth of information about how people trained, how the logistics were pre-race, what kind of challenges they faced during the race, and how they felt like they should have handled them differently, so that hopefully I can handle them differently. So many of the Boston reports had people say that they went out a little faster than planned because they just felt so darn good during the downhill section, and then it often came back to bite them at mile 16 or even after mile 21 when the hills were over, but then there were still 5 miles left to go. That really helped hammer home to me that I needed to go out and strictly stick to my power or effort or pace target for that section of the race, that downhill. The other thing I use is new this year. It's course previews. Similar to the race reports, I've been using these course previews on YouTube to try to know everything I can about the race before I get there. The people who make these will talk you through strategies, landmarks, elevation changes, and even get down to water stop strategy in the video. Two particularly helpful ones I've tuned into have been called Boston Marathon Course Strategy and Logistics 2023 from Coach Chris R.S. and Boston Marathon Course Preview and Perfectly Pace Your Next Race with Stride's Race Power Calculator from Stride. I try not to set concrete goals until shortly before the race. Having training goals set from the start of a training block gives you something to work towards, sure, but it also sets a bar that gets pretty hard to move come race day. I know that for every healthy training cycle, I'd like to PR the race, but I also know that running is a fickle mistress, so I try not to set goals or set them as loosely as I can until the hay's in the barn and it's time to see what's realistic. Through reading those Reddit race reports and writing a few myself, I have taken a broader approach to goal setting for races. There's so much that can go wrong on race day that I try not to get too married to the idea of hitting a certain time goal. My goals more recently have been mindset or approach-based goals. For Houston, I really wanted to stay calm before the race, keep it a positive mindset during the race, and then, only then, did I line out a time goal, which was sub 3:30. For Boston, my goals are very similar. If the weather ends up being bad, whatever bad means, which is probably going to be a game time decision because the weather keeps changing, then my goals are going to be to soak in the experience of running the Boston Marathon, engage with the course as much as possible, and have a good time. As a runner who races to set PRs and give my all in a race, I don't usually set a goal of have a good time, or at least not in the sense of having fun and enjoying myself, but Boston is different. Boston can be run almost as a reward race. You qualified, you stayed healthy, and as a little treat, you get to run a marathon. Actually, that seems like a really bum deal. But the crowds and the history make up so much of the mythology of Boston, and running it the first time, I want to take all of that in and truly engage in the race. So if those are my bad weather goals, what are my good weather goals? Pretty much exactly the same, but I'd add a goal of running sub 3:30 again, and then maybe a stretch goal of PRing. I know this training cycle has been one of the best ones I've ever had, but I would rather run a little bit more slowly and be able to come away with an enjoyable experience than have the race of my life, get a PR, and realize I didn't partake in the Boston-ness of Boston. Okay, this is super corny, I know, so stay with me. Back when I was still doing a running podcast, I decided to go up to Boston to spectate the marathon. Shalane, just 6 months before, had won New York, and there was a lot of buzz about her potentially doing the same thing on her home course at Boston. My favorite runner was Des Linden. She caught my eye because she was the woman running in split shorts when everyone else was wearing racing briefs. Then, as I learned more about pro racing, I realized how much I appreciated her approach to racing and training. She wasn't sponsored by Nike, which was a plus to me even back then. She was an impeccably consistent racer with even splits in so many of her marathons. She seemed to prefer a long-term approach to success when it came to training and didn't seem to be interested in taking some of the shortcuts that other training groups at the time did. She showed up to races ready to run her own race and do her best. She hadn't won a major yet, but she had made 2 Olympic teams and was outspoken against doping in the sport. I loved her, and I saw some of the person I hoped to be in Des. Well, that year that I went up to spectate, the weather turned really nasty. When my friend and I went to get some miles in before the race started, it was raining and sleeting on us. As we ran around the Charles, we talked about how thankful we were that we didn't have to race that day. We met up at the track house on Newberry to stay warm and dry and just watch the pros battle it out. Yuki Kawauchi was doing this weird thing where he would surge ahead and then come back to the pack, and it really didn't seem like it was going to bode well for him because he wasn't making any progress. Des, for whom I was rooting, seemed like she had fallen off the pack pretty early on. In case you're not already onto me by now, this was the 2018 Boston Marathon. The one with the cold and the rain and the snow. It was the one where a huge percentage of the field DNF'd, and the one where I got to see Des Linden leading the race about a kilometer before she won the Boston Marathon. I was thrilled. I was out of my mind that my favorite marathoner had finally won herself a major, and it was at Boston, and I had gotten to see it. She's running it again this year, and she released a book a week or two ago. The book intertwined the story of that Boston Marathon with her life leading up to that day. Reading her account of her mental state before and during the race gave me a little bit of grit. I'm not going out to win the thing on Monday, but I do want to absorb whatever I can to give me strength when the race gets difficult, and I know it's going to get difficult. I want to be able to fall back on something to make myself dig a little deeper or run a little taller when I'm facing the Newton Hills. I found some of that in her book. I also have one more book that I'm planning on reading during the trip up to Boston. It's a book written by Chase Parham about the Ole Miss Baseball National Championship from last year. It's called Resilient Rebels. The Ole Miss Rebels last year were a stacked team that just fell apart halfway through the season, managed to barely make the postseason, and eventually won it all. Even though I know how it ends, I want to know more about the journey, and I want to understand their grit and perseverance, and be able to take some of that with me out to Hopkinton on Monday. This one's getting pretty long, but I hope you can find some useful ways to manage taper crazies for your next race. I'm filming this on Thursday before the Boston Marathon, and I don't know how things are going to turn out, but I do know that I'm going to be in the best shape I can be to stay calm, cool, and collected over the next 4 days. Thanks for watching, and if this video was helpful, go ahead and hit the like button, and if you're interested in seeing how Boston turns out for me, as I kinda am, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I'm saying it because I literally always forget to do that unless someone tells me to, so here is me being that person for you. Thanks again, and happy running.